Good morning, everyone. Sorry I had to cancel class this morning. Fortunately, my wheelchair lift wasn't working and I can't get on campus without that. So hopefully it will get fixed today and I'll be back on campus on Thursday. Just a reminder that Thursday's class is not required. I will be there. I will not be teaching any new material. It'll be more of a study hall. You can come and work on your research participation requirement. That's why I gave you the class day off, because I wanted you to get that started. If you have any questions about it, feel free to come to class. I'll be there. I can answer any questions you have. Or if you just want to work on study objectives for this next unit, feel free to come into class, but I will not be lecturing or teaching any new material that day. And then you all will have most likely a much needed break. Spring break is next week, so there will be no classes, and then I will see you the week after that. Okay, so this unit, we're going to be looking at chapter 12. We'll be starting there and talking about psychological disorders. As we get into this topic, just a reminder that we do have mental health services here at Sac State, student health and counseling services, which are really great. These are resources available to you as students for free. The cost is wrapped up into your tuition, so you can always go here if you need to talk to someone or if you need help. This is a great resource on campus for you. Okay. So let's jump right into it. I'm not going to go into detail on every single psychological disorder. Of course, we don't have time for that in this class, but I'll be touching on the main ones that you're most likely to hear about, and those that are researched pretty heavily and talked about and looked at. So we're going to start with schizophrenia. This is a psychological disorder where the affect, behavior, and thoughts of a person are severely altered in some way. This is not a split personality disorder. Many mistakenly think that it is, but rather it is a split or break from reality. Okay, so schizo refers to split or cut, and friend is of the mind or reason. So it's essentially stating that individuals who have schizophrenia are not in tune with what is really happening in the environment and in their lives. That is why they often have various thoughts of grandiose things happening to them, or they're paranoid that people are following them because they have this sort of break or split from reality. And there's the definition again: a psychological disorder where the affect, behavior, and thoughts of a person are severely altered. It is in the DSM-5 under the category of schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders. So I'll kind of just show you according to the DSM-5. So this is what is used when people are getting diagnosed. If they fit the diagnosis in the DSM-5, which has been agreed upon by researchers and doctors across the board. So if they fit these requirements, then most likely they would have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So in order to be officially diagnosed with this disorder, the individual has to exhibit at least 2 of the following criteria. So these are all of the ones listed in the DSM-5. So we have hallucinations. These can be auditory or somatic. Delusions, these are often linked to hallucination as well. Disorganized speech, disorganized or catatonic behavior, and negative symptoms, which we'll talk about in just a moment. They also have to show some sort of social and or occupational dysfunction for at least 6 months, a minimum of 6 months or more. So again, in order for an individual to be diagnosed officially with schizophrenia, they have to have 2 of those following, 2 of those criteria. And then they also have to show social or occupational dysfunction, and it has to have lasted for at least 6 months. So let's talk about positive versus negative symptoms of schizophrenia. A positive symptom is one that is an excess or a distortion of normal functions. So behaviors like having delusions, hallucinations, disordered behavior, disorganized speech, these are an excess of a certain behavior. So often you'll see the disorganized speech. They are talking really fast. They talk a lot. Or a distortion of normal function. So the hallucination or the delusions, they're unable to tell the difference between reality and their distorted view of it. So these are called positive symptoms. Whereas negative symptoms are a decrease or a loss in normal function. Things like having flat affect, right? So no response, no facial response when people are talking to them or when things happen to them. They just have a flat affect, no response. A lack of speech, a decrease in motivation for self-directed or purposeful activities. So the negative symptoms are talking about a loss of normal functioning, whereas positive symptoms are talking about an excess or distortion of normal functioning. So that's how we look at the differences when we're looking at symptoms of schizophrenia. The onset of schizophrenia is slightly different for males versus females. For males, the typical age of onset is between 20 to 35 years of age, with most of them occurring sort of in the younger years, 20 to 30. So in males, this is diagnosed typically very young. They start seeing symptoms around age 20, 21, and those symptoms can progressively get worse if they aren't diagnosed and it's addressed with medication. Whereas for females, the typical age of onset is much later, closer to between 35 and about 55, all the way up until age 65. But you've got most of the diagnosis occurring between the ages of 35 to 50 for women. So it's a little bit later in women, a lot earlier in males. Oh, I had little boxes to demonstrate that. So there's the age range for males and the high age range for women. Schizophrenia is attributed to both biological and environmental factors. So it's not just one or the other, but because it is more common in some families, you often see multiple individuals within a family have or be diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it is thought that genetic factors do tend to be at least involved in your susceptibility or likelihood of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So if there are people in your family that have been diagnosed with schizophrenia as well, that increases your chances of you being diagnosed with it. And the closer the genetic link is between the individual and their family member, the more likely it is that they'll be diagnosed with that condition. So if a father is diagnosed with schizophrenia, the son's chances of also developing the disorder are pretty high. Let's see if I have. But in the general population, so if you're not related to someone who has schizophrenia, there's only about a 1% chance of you being diagnosed with this disorder, versus identical twins. Okay, so they share 100% of the same genes. So this is a genetic component coming into play. If your identical twin is diagnosed with schizophrenia, you have a 48% chance that you will also be diagnosed as well. So you can see that the closer you get to your genetic similarities, the higher the percentage of chance that you'll be diagnosed with it as well. You can see their children, and parents is 6 to 13%, siblings are 9%. So the closer the closer you are, the genetic links are between the individual and their diagnosed family members, certainly increases their chances of being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Another biological explanation for this diagnosis is something called the dopamine hypothesis. So this suggests that schizophrenia is a result of excess activity in certain areas of the brain, and specifically areas of the brain that use dopamine as a neurotransmitter. So this sort of excessive activity in the brain, it produces an excessive amount of dopamine, can cause abnormal functioning and result in a dopamine-dependent brain system. So this sort of over excessive production of dopamine in the brain is thought to contribute to the symptoms of schizophrenia. This was first discovered when dopamine blocking drugs were used to treat schizophrenia, and they saw a reduction in symptoms when they used these specific drugs. So those drugs that specifically block the dopamine neurotransmitter. So as those went down, as that excess activity actually decreased quite a bit, they also saw a decrease in the symptoms of schizophrenia. There's another hypothesis that schizophrenia could also be a result of brain structure abnormalities. So the first is related to the ventricular enlargement. This results in a reduction of gray and white matter, and including matter that is in the frontal cortex. So this is where the gray matter includes region of the brain that control things like muscle memory, emotions, speech decision-making, self-control, abstract thinking and planning and understanding, that behaviors have consequences when you engage in them. So we do see a reduction in the ability to do these things in individuals who have schizophrenia. Their emotions, their speech decision making, those things are significantly decreased. Their emotions run high. Self-control is pretty low. Abstract thinking, they have issues with that. And that is all associated with the gray matter regions of the brain. Additionally, we also typically see a relatively small thalamus. So this is where information is received in the brain. So things like sensory or motor stimuli. So the sensory stimulation from your environment that comes into your brain and then is relayed to other areas. We do see a relatively small thalamus. We also see a small hippocampus, which is the part of the brain responsible for memory storage. So we do see a lot of memory gaps with individuals who are dealing with schizophrenia and are not on any kind of treatment or are not taking any sort of medication for the disorder. We also have seen similar brain abnormalities that have resulted in schizophrenic individuals from maternal malnourishment or illness or stress or any birth-related complications that resulted in the fetus being deprived of oxygen in some way. This can actually cause brain abnormalities similar to these, so the small thalamus, the small hippocampus, which can then result in the individual being diagnosed with schizophrenia down the line. Now, this is a theory that has come into play for, remember I talked about, I'll go back to the slide, how in the general population, you have about a 1% chance if no one in your family has ever been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but there's still a 1% chance that you could be diagnosed with it at some point in your life. There is a theory that talks about how this maternal malnourishment or illness that occurs while the fetus is growing, that could be attributing to that 1% of general population. So if the fetus was deprived of oxygen while it was growing, even if no one in their family has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, that could increase their chances of it if there's some brain abnormality that occurs there. So here are some images that you can see you can actually see the brain abnormalities here. First, let's look at the top. You're seeing scans of identical twins here. The brain on the left is typically a typically developing individual, whereas the image on the right is the individual diagnosed with schizophrenia. And what you're looking at here it's that kind of, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, but it's this little sort of, I guess, leaf-shaped kind of V. This is the ventricular enlargement here. So you can see on the affected brain, it's quite a bit larger here. So we're looking at identical twins. The brain on the right is the individual who has schizophrenia, and it's much smaller than the one with the brain on the left. And they show it again here with identical twins. So we're looking at right about here, and you can definitely see the enlargement here on the affected individual. At the bottom, we have an image of cellular disarray in the hippocampus. So again, this is responsible for memory, and we often see this sort of disarray in individuals with schizophrenia. So again, on the left-hand side, you see a normal distribution of cellular arrangement. And then here on the right-hand side, you have the individual with schizophrenia, and you can see within the hippocampus that cellular disarray. Again, making it more difficult for them to retain memory, because this is the portion of the brain that's responsible for memory storage. Here's some more examples of brain abnormalities we might see with individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia. Something called hyperfrontality. This is a lower functioning of the frontal lobe. So someone with normal brain functioning during what they do is they do a card scoring test. So they give them this test, and what they're measuring is the brain functioning while they're being shown this test. Normal brain functioning looks like the top pictures. So here you have top pictures here. But down here during the card sorting test is an individual with schizophrenia and their brain functioning. And you can see the lower amount of functioning in the frontal lobe. So here you've got some blues and things like that. You've got a lot of functioning here. But down here, you don't have as much. And this one is all green, actually, mostly green and yellow. So much lower functioning in that frontal lobe area. Okay. Now we're going to move on to depressive disorders. This is one of the more common disorders of the mood disorders that we'll talk about. Anyone or anywhere between 6 and 10% of the population in the US experiences depression. About 1 in 5 experience major depression at some point in their lives. And about 15% of college students have been diagnosed with depression during their academic years. So it's a pretty good amount of the population when you're looking at numbers like that. Depressive disorders are characterized by feelings of sadness or emptiness, irritable moods, loss of interest in activities of any kind. And we often also see these individuals have some sort of sleep, eating, or energy issues. Now, those individuals who are dealing with major depression, the 1 in 5, that those individuals are experiencing drastic swings. So often they'll have severe insomnia where they don't sleep for days on end, or they won't get out of bed for days or weeks. They sort of are just not affected by anything going on in their lives, kind of apathetic to everything around them. So it can get pretty severe in terms of their day-to-day functioning and how that is affected by this disorder. There is a depressive disorder category also in the DSM-5. This category includes disorders such as persistent depressive disorder, major depressive disorder, and disruptive mood dysregulation. So let's look at what the category looks like in the DSM-5 and the criteria for this. So in order to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder, you have to have 5 or more of the following symptoms during the same 2-week period and change in functioning as well. So 5 of these at least, and they have to occur within a 2-week period. So depressed mood for most of the day, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in daily activities, significant weight loss or gain, and not as a result of dieting. So this is just either the individual is overeating or the individual has lost their appetite altogether and is not eating at all. Insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day. So again, this is staying awake for days on end or sleeping 24/7. Psychomotor agitation, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, diminished concentration and indecisiveness, so they're unable to make decisions, and of course, recurrent thoughts of suicide. So if we see at least 5 of these within a 2-week period of an individual, most likely they would be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. Additionally, the DSM-5 specifies that these symptoms can cause clinically significant distress that result in an individual's inability to fully function in their life. So if the individuals have those symptoms that we listed on the previous slide, and they cannot function in some area of their life, so if their daily functioning is being inhibited because of these symptoms, then the individual would receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. If the episode is not attributed to physiological effects of a substance or another medical condition that could be better explained by this, it might not be a major depressive disorder. It might be something like bipolar disorder. But again, those things would have to be looked at, and all of the criteria are looked at and compared in the DSM-5. So major depressive disorder versus something like bipolar disorder. So let's look at the biological factors of major depressive disorder. For identical twins who, now remember, identical twins share 100% of the same DNA if they're identical twins. If one is diagnosed with major depressive disorder, the other twin is 4 times more likely to also be diagnosed with that disorder. As far as brain activity goes for these individuals, we do see lower activity in certain areas of the brain, and I'm going to show you some brain scans in a moment. And we also see these individuals show a lot of changes in their serotonin and noradrenaline levels. Also, their norepinephrine are often affected as well. It is still not clear which are most involved of those ones. Typically, an individual who is diagnosed with major depressive disorder, often they will be given an SSRI medication, which addresses the serotonin levels in the brain. And then they'll be given additional medication that is similar to an SSRI, but these medications only target the norepinephrine neurotransmitters. So often you'll see individuals with major depressive disorder on multiple medications that are addressing different neurotransmitters to kind of get those all evened out, because it's still not entirely known which one is most involved in causing these symptoms and resulting in these changes in the brain. So here is a brain scan with an individual diagnosed with depression on the left versus a healthy individual on the right. So you can see pretty clearly that the overall brain activity is much lower for the individual diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And we see much lower functioning, much lower brain activity than a person who's not depressed. There are a few hypotheses surrounding depressive disorders and how they contribute to the individual's cognition. So from this viewpoint, the cognitive viewpoint, depression is a result of negative bias in thinking processes of the individual. So basically what they're talking about here, individuals who are diagnosed with this will often engage in this sort of illogical or disordered thinking that they're worthless, they're not good enough, they're a failure, and overall, they just have this sort of bleak outlook on life. They're more pessimistic. They're the half glass empty sort of viewpoint. And people with depression often think in this way. So they call them cognitive distortions, where they distort their viewpoint of the world and their environment, what is happening around them, to have a very negative viewpoint. They sort of distort everything and turn it around on the negative side. So that's kind of the hypothesis from the cognitive viewpoint. And these sort of constant errors in thinking, where they're sort of changing everything, or everything that happens to them, they look at it from the negative viewpoint. It will maintain this outlook on life that then perpetuates those depressing feelings, right? So things happen to them and they look at it from the negative viewpoint, and then they get depressed about it. And then because they're depressed about it, something else happens to them and they look at it from a negative viewpoint, which makes them more depressed, and so on and so forth. And it's just this vicious, nasty cycle of cognitive distortions and negative thinking that can contribute to one's level of depression. Here are some examples of these cognitive distortions that can occur. And these are ones that often maintain this sort of negative thinking process and emotions that individuals who are depressed often experience. The all or nothing thinking, thinking in terms of always, never, or every. Honestly, few aspects of human behavior and of our environment are so absolute. It's hardly ever that something never happens or something always happens, but individuals who are depressed often think in this way. Disqualifying the positive. So even if something positive does happen to them, they sort of shut it down, right? They discount it for meaningless reasons, typically, but they sort of just, oh, that was luck, or that never happens to me, that really wasn't that positive of a thing, and so on and so forth. So they sort of just shut down anything good that would happen to them. Jumping to conclusions. So this is assuming that something is wrong or negative before it happens. So it's worried about something they would do or something that would happen. It's going to be negative, or it's going to be bad, or I'm going to be wrong, so I might as well not do it at all. And often that's actually incorrect. It hasn't even happened yet, first of all, so how would they even know if that's the case? So they jump to the conclusion long before they should. Magnification and minimization. This involves exaggerating instances that are negative, and minimizing or understating instances that are positive. So again, it's focusing on those negative events that happen to them and sort of downplaying anything good that might happen to them. And finally, emotional reasoning. So making decisions or building arguments based on how you feel and your emotions, rather than your objective reality. So it's not making decisions on what is truly happening in the environment, but rather just on how you feel. Okay, so again, these are all the cognitive distortions that, from a cognitive viewpoint and hypotheses, individuals with depression think in this way. This is just an illustration to sort of show you where the individual has negative views of all these things, the world, their own self, and the view of the future. So overall, these individuals do have a very bleak and pessimistic view of the world. They call it the negative triad of depression. You have a negative view of the world, you have a negative view of your own self, and you have a negative view of the future. There's also something that can occur called learned helplessness. This is where an individual is unable to escape any unpleasantness in their environment, no matter what they do, no matter how they behave. Now, we see this all the time with individuals, especially people who are under high amounts of stress for very long periods of time. No matter what they do, no matter what they get off their plate, no matter how many things they get done, they're still under high amounts of stress. They're always stressed. We see this in high profile jobs, or people who work multiple jobs or trying to put food on the table. Single parents often experience this. And what happens is that because no matter what they do, they're always stressed. That never changes. Eventually, we see them stop behaving altogether. We see them stop trying, because even when they try very, very hard, nothing ever changes. And it often results in the development of depression. So it's sort of the beginning of an individual becoming in a depressed state from this constant, never changing feeling of stress, even though they're working very hard to remove that stress. It just never goes away. It never ends. And when people feel that they just have no control over the environment, they're much more likely to develop depression. This was investigated with rats. It's actually a very sad experiment. They don't do it anymore, but way long time ago, when they were first looking at this thing called learned helplessness, they put a rat in a chamber and the floor would shock their feet. And originally, if the rat pressed a lever, they could stop the shock. But what the experiment did was they continued to shock the rat, even if the rat was pressing the lever. And what happened was the rat stopped behaving altogether. It stopped pressing the lever. It stopped trying to jump out of the cage. It stopped trying to move around the cage. It just ends up sitting there and getting shocked. And that's learned helplessness. It's when the organism behaves, but the bad thing doesn't end. The bad thing, the shock, the stress, it never ends no matter how you behave. And then this learned helplessness can develop. Okay. So now we're going to switch gears again, and we're going to talk about anxiety disorders. For this category of disorders, the hallmark or telling symptom is intense or pervasive, which is consistent and ongoing anxiety or fear, or attempts to avoid these feelings. And often the attempts to avoid them are extreme behaviors that an individual would take. The category consists of 12 different disorders. So in the DSM-5, there are 12 different anxiety disorders. These include things like separation anxiety, panic disorder, social anxiety, agoraphobia, which is not wanting to leave the home. And there are 12 different disorders in this category. These can be really debilitating. Not just those feelings of anxiety or fear, which in and of themselves can be debilitating, but some individuals go so far as to never leave their home ever, just to avoid feelings of anxiety that might occur when they leave the home or when they're out in the natural world, which would, of course, drastically alter their quality of life. If you are so anxious or so afraid of becoming anxious or experiencing an anxious episode that you never leave your home, that's highly problematic. And so when I said before that the attempts to avoid these feelings are very drastic, this is what I'm talking about. This is a drastic change in your lifestyle of never leaving your home just to avoid those anxious feelings that you might experience. We often also see, not surprisingly at all, we often see these individuals also being diagnosed with depression in addition to their anxiety, especially someone who has placed themselves under lock and key in their home and never leaves because they're so afraid of having an anxious episode or a panic episode. And they're often depressed, because who wouldn't be if you're stuck in your house all day because of anxiety? So one example that falls into the category of anxiety disorders are panic disorders. So this is a specific type of disorder that involves the individual experiencing panic attacks or the individual going to extreme measures to avoid the panic attack. So a panic attack is an episode where the individual experiences intense feelings of fear, and that feeling is actually accompanied by one or more physical symptoms that are happening in their body. So things like rapid heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, chest pain, nausea, and so on. So not only do they experience intense feelings of fear, but there are also physical symptoms that are actually happening in their body when the panic attack occurs. If you have ever seen someone actually have a real, true panic attack, it is pretty traumatic. These symptoms can be so severe that the individual may actually think that they're dying because they can't breathe, for one. Their heart is beating rapidly. They may think they're having a heart attack, or that their body is just shutting down completely. And they actually can't breathe. They're not able to take a deep enough breath to get enough oxygen. So they may actually pass out because they're unable to breathe. Typically, once they pass out, their body relaxes and they're able to get oxygen again. Their heart rate often slows down. But up until that point, it's very scary. They think they're dying because they can't breathe. So, I think people joke a lot, oh, I had a panic attack, or oh, I'm going to have a panic attack. But it really isn't anything to joke about. Panic attacks are very scary when you see them happen. I have seen them happen to people. And it's quite traumatic. So just keep that in mind, the next time you throw the panic attack comment or joke out there, that, these are very severe symptoms of a disorder that people are diagnosed with. And the panic attacks can be persistent, where they occur over a regular basis, just periodically, or they can be episodic, which means they occur in very specific circumstances. So, for example, individuals who have like a fear disorder. So they're afraid of elevators, or they're afraid of insects, or they're afraid of snakes. They may have a panic attack in very specific circumstances that expose them to those things. So when they get in an elevator, they may have a panic attack. Or if they see a snake on the ground, they may have a panic attack. And this is what often leads people to never leave their homes, because they're so afraid of coming in contact with that stimulus that causes them to have a panic attack that they say, forget it, I'm just not going to leave my home, because at least I know in my home, there's nothing here that's going to set me off and I won't have a panic attack, right? I won't be in one of those circumstances that happens to me. So typically for the individuals who have episodic panic attacks, those are the individuals we often see eventually never leave their home, especially if their panic attacks are really severe and happen in multiple circumstances. So maybe an individual, has doesn't like being in large groups. Well, lots of places that you go, you're surrounded by a lot of people when you go shopping, or when you go to the mall, or when you go to an event. And so they avoid all of those situations altogether, and they stay home. So we often see that with individuals who have panic attacks. More diagnosis criteria. So according to the DSM-5, in order to actually be diagnosed with a panic disorder, the individual has to experience either recurring or unexpected panic attacks at some point, and they have to have at least 4 of the symptoms listed here. when the panic attack is occurring. So heart palpitations is one, sweating, trembling or shaking, sensations of shortness of breath, feelings of choking, chest pain or discomfort, nausea or abdominal distress, feeling dizzy or lightheaded, either chills or heat sensation, paresthesia, which is numbness or tingling of the limbs, derealization, which is feelings of unreality or depersonalization, so being detached from your own self, fear of losing control, and fear of dying. So if they have at least 4 of these symptoms and they have either reoccurring or unexpected panic attacks, then they would be diagnosed with a panic disorder. It also specifies that at least one of the attacks has to be followed within 1 month of the symptoms or of the attack. The individual has to experience persistent concern or worry about future possible panic attacks. So they're very worried that they're going to have more, or that because of the panic attack, they might have a heart attack, or they're going to lose their mind, right? And when they say, I'm going to go crazy, right? So they have this persistent fear of the future after they've had the panic attack. Or we might see a significant change in the behavior that they engage in to avoid those attacks. So I've already talked about this previously, but again, we're talking about very drastic behavior changes. Never using an elevator ever again. Never being able to use an elevator. Never being able to go to a group gathering of more than 10 people. Or never leaving your home. Right? Never leaving the front door. So these are all very drastic behavior changes that can occur when an individual experiences these panic attacks. And these panic attacks or these behaviors can't be attributed to some other reason. So things like substance abuse or a different medical condition. So typically they will run a number of tests. When an individual has unexpected or reoccurring panic attacks, they'll run a number of tests on the individual to ensure that there's not some other medical issue that's sort of underlying before they're diagnosed with panic disorder. So it's not that you have a panic attack and then automatically you're diagnosed with a panic disorder, especially because all of these physical symptoms often occur at the same time: heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, numbness of the limbs. They're definitely going to run a bunch of tests on you to make sure there's not something else going on in your body that they have to address medically. If they don't find anything, then they would start going down the road of possibly giving the diagnosis of a panic disorder. Okay, let's talk about phobias. So phobias can also develop in an individual's diagnosed with anxiety disorders. So I kind of talked about this, where people are afraid of certain things and they get very anxious about those things and maybe have a panic attack in the presence of those phobias. So a phobia is an irrational fear of an object, a person, or a situation. And these fears are extreme enough to impact the individual's ability to successfully function in their everyday life. Okay, so these fears actually impact how successfully they can navigate through everyday life and through just doing normal things, going to a job and having friends and being in a relationship and all of those things. From a biological standpoint, the anxiety response that you experience with a phobia involves the same structures and processes that happen or that are responsible for your stress response, right? Your fight or flight. That's what you can think about, it is useful to a point. The fight or flight response, or that anxiety response when you're in a dangerous or unsafe or unknown situation, is useful some of the time, right? It contributes to or increases your chance of survival. If you think back centuries, right, thousands of years ago when our ancestors were evolving, those individuals who responded to that fight or flight response survived, right? When there was a predator hunting them, the person who had a biological change where they had anxious feelings and their heart rate increased and they fled, they survived. And those that did not respond or did not have the fight or flight response were probably attacked and killed by the predator. So you can see how these things biologically evolve and are useful to the survival of our species. However, for individuals who have phobias, these responses occur even if there is no danger or no threat, no actual danger or threat. So there's sort of this over or excessive occurrence of this fight or flight response or of these anxious feelings. So while they're useful in some circumstances, these individuals experience them all the time, even if there is no danger or threat. There are different theories as to what structures are affected for individuals who have the phobias. We often see an over arousal of the sympathetic nervous system when they're in front of the stimulus that makes them afraid or that they have the phobia of. So this system, the sympathetic system, is involved in the fear or the fight or flight response. So it makes sense that individuals with phobias have overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's overworking, okay? It's over aroused. So when the individual sees that object that they're afraid of, the sympathetic nervous system sort of goes into overdrive, okay? Just like it does when it's needed for the fight or flight response. But that response is triggered in the presence of some object for that individual, even if the object is not dangerous and is not a threat. There's still this response that happens in these individuals who have phobias. The amygdala is also often triggered in the presence of the object associated with the phobia. Again, the amygdala is involved in processing fear and a startle response to certain stimuli. So loud noises, bright lights, fast-moving objects. So the amygdala is triggered to respond to those things, your startle response. So again, this same part is triggered when the individual is in the presence of the object or the person or the place that they have a phobia of. Okay, so their amygdala is triggered, just like it's triggered when you have a startle response. These individuals are experiencing the startle response or fear response from the amygdala every time they're in front of these certain stimuli, even if they're not dangerous. There have been studies on this, on the amygdala abnormality, where the responsiveness of the amygdala was compared between individuals who have phobias and individuals who don't. Okay, so that what they were looking at here was social phobias. And what they found was that those people who had social phobias have a much more responsive or active amygdala. And they concluded, therefore, that people with more responsive amygdalas probably are more susceptible to stimuli that evoke fear of some kind. So, meaning they have a more active amygdala, it's more responsive, it's more sensitive to things. People who have social phobias, it's more sensitive than an individual who does not have a social phobia. And therefore, because these individuals' amygdala are more sensitive to stimuli in the environment, then they're more likely to experience a fear response in front of certain stimuli and develop a phobia. But the question is it that individuals have a more responsive amygdala and are therefore more susceptible to phobias? Or is it that those who are more fearful of objects then result in having a more active amygdala. So it's sort of a chicken and egg, which comes first situation. And this study really didn't flush that out. They really didn't look too much into that because it is really hard to parse that out in this type of research. It is hard to figure out if the fearful response came first before and that triggered the amygdala to then be more active and more sensitive, or if the amygdala starts out as being more sensitive and then the individual is more fearful of stimuli. It's really hard to parse those things out and figure out which one comes first. So even though this study makes these claims, you do have to view these results with some skepticism because they did not account for that discrepancy. They don't talk about it very much. It's sort of a mention, but it's not something that they dive into, and they should, right? Because that would certainly affect the results. Now, there are also theories that phobias are actually learned from experiences with the environment. It's probably not a surprise that behavior analysts, much like myself, we are of the mind that phobias are learned. Okay, that we attribute these to learning theory, whether they learn them through classical conditioning, operant, or even through social learning, which is someone else is afraid, you witness someone else being afraid of this thing, and then you're afraid of it too. Mom is definitely afraid of spiders and screams and yells and runs away from them. So the child will often be afraid of spiders as well because they've observed mom being afraid of them, right? So I subscribe to the learning theory behind phobias. And it looks at this as sort of a two-stage process where first there's the acquisition of the phobia. So that's often when fear is paired with an object the first time. So it's the first time you experience fear in front of a certain object. But then there's a maintenance of the phobia behavior in other circumstances where you might also experience those feelings of fear and they sort of generalize to other situations. So first you acquire the phobia, it's the first time you experience fear, and then that might continue as time goes on. So let's talk about how this might happen through these three different methods. So first, it can be acquired or developed through classical conditioning. Okay, so remember, classical conditioning is when an unconditioned stimulus is presented that produces an unconditioned response. And a neutral stimulus is paired with that unconditioned stimulus. Okay, think about Pavlov's dogs and the bell that we learned about back in week 1. Okay, so for classical conditioning, some sort of traumatic experience might happen. Okay, so for example, maybe you get bit by a dog. This results in pain, right? The bite is the unconditioned stimulus that results in the unconditioned response of pain. No one has to teach you that a sharp object piercing your skin hurts and that you should experience the pain response in your body. Okay, no one has to teach you that. The neutral stimulus in this example is the dog. Okay, so the neutral stimulus, which is the dog, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus of the bite and of pain, right? Which will then result in a conditioned response of fear. Okay, so again, no one has to teach you how to respond to pain. That is untaught. But you do have to learn through experience whether or not dogs are scary. Some people are afraid of dogs, and this is why. They have some sort of traumatic experience that occurred, usually in childhood or in the past, and then the dog is paired with that traumatic experience, and now when they see a dog, they experience fear. They have a panic attack or a fear response through classical conditioning. Another example would be an alarm goes off while you're in an elevator. Even though everything was fine, it's a false alarm. And you might experience a fear or startle response in the elevator. So again, let's talk through this example, okay? The loud noise or the alarm is the unconditioned stimulus that results in the unconditioned response of a startle response. It scares you and it startles you, like a really loud alarm, right? The neutral stimulus is the elevator. Again, no one has to teach you how to respond to a very loud noise, but you aren't born knowing whether or not elevators are good or bad or scary or safe or not. But because that startle response occurred within the elevator, that neutral stimulus, which is the elevator, is now paired. It's now paired with that loud sound and that startle response. And the next time you go to get in the elevator, you might experience a panic attack or a startle response, which is the conditioned response now. In the presence of the once neutral stimulus, it's not so neutral anymore. Now the elevator is a conditioned stimulus, and even if everything's fine and everything's safe, you may experience a startle or fear response in the presence of the elevator. Pairing aversive stimuli with a neutral stimulus, like the example of little Albert, right? The white rat that was paired with the loud sound. So the rat, the infant was not afraid of the white rat to begin with, but then they started banging loud sounds and it startled the infant. And whenever that happened, the rat was present. And it got to the point where that neutral stimulus, which was the white rat, was paired with that startle fear response enough that eventually the child experienced a fear response in the presence of the rat alone. Okay, so all of this is through classical conditioning. So if you don't remember how classical conditioning works, I really encourage you to go back to I think chapter 5 that we talked about in the first couple of weeks, because if you don't understand classical conditioning, you're not going to understand how this works, okay? But this is sort of the theory behind how phobias can actually be learned through experiences that you have. Phobias can also be learned through social learning, which is just to say that as humans, we learn from each other. Okay, you can observe other people engaging in certain behaviors, and then you can engage in those same behaviors yourself. You can see someone being afraid of something, and you may also be afraid of it too. Think about how many children are afraid of the dentist before they even go. Now, if you're afraid of the dentist because you had a bad experience, right? Pain was associated with that. That is classical conditioning. The dentist was paired with pain, and now the dentist is a conditioned stimulus for the fear response, okay? But for some kids, the parents just hate the dentist. They talk about it. They talk about how they're nervous before they go. And then the child learns before they've ever even gone to the dentist to also be afraid and nervous when going to the dentist. They learn social learning. They learn from observation. These things are useful. Social learning is very useful. I can see someone engage in some behavior and have a consequence because of it, and then understand I shouldn't do that because the same thing will happen to me. I can witness my brother yelling at my mom and getting in trouble and going, oh, well, I better not do that or I'll get in trouble too, right? So social learning is very useful in our evolution and for our survival and all of those things. But you can also learn things wrong. You can learn to fear things, even if you shouldn't, right? You can also hear about something dangerous from someone else. So someone just telling you that you should be scared of something can result in you actually being afraid of it. So this social learning can go pretty far. You can see it happen, and you can also just be told that you should fear something. And then finally, phobias are often maintained through operant conditioning. So usually we see phobias develop through classical conditioning, but then are maintained through operant conditioning. So for example, if an individual experiences the conditioned response of anxiety or fear when they're near the object that was paired with this, then they try to get away from that object. And because they get away from the object, they're not as afraid anymore. They're not panicking as much. So let me put that in an example, okay? Let's go back to the elevator example. The first time you were afraid of the elevator, it happened because of classical conditioning. The loud alarm went off, it caused a startle response. You happen to be in an elevator, and now, whenever you're in an elevator, you experience the startle or fear response. But you've noticed that every time you get near an elevator, you start to feel anxious and fearful. But when you walk away, you don't have those feelings anymore. You're reinforced for avoiding the elevator. And that's how the phobia is maintained over time. Because every time you feel afraid of the elevator, if you leave, those feelings go away and you feel better. So over time, you start avoiding the elevator more and more because you want to avoid all those anxious and fearful feelings that you have when you're in an elevator. Okay. This is negative reinforcement. It's removing the aversive stimulus to make your life better. All right. You engage in some behavior and the aversive stimulus is removed. And as a result, you're more likely to engage in that behavior to avoid the aversive stimulus in the future or avoid those feelings. And the phobia just persists for very long periods of time. There are numerous behavior treatments for this. There's lots of books and procedures that have been written on this as to, because it's learned, if it's learned, we can break the association between the stimuli. Oh, sorry, cat. Just like you can sort of break the pairing in classical conditioning by not presenting the unconditioned stimulus, you can make the conditioned stimulus neutral again. So you can do that with phobias. We'll get into how phobias are treated in the next chapter in this unit, but there are ways that you can expose the individual slowly and safely to these stimuli over time, and they can relearn a new pairing where they don't experience fearful or anxiety feelings. All right, I'm going to stop there for today. Hopefully I'll see some of you on Thursday, but again, it is not required for you to attend. And if I don't see you, have a wonderful spring break, and I'll see you when we all get back.